On September 30th, 1946, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg officially stepped forward and declared the entire SS a criminal organization. That single ruling suddenly made simply belonging to the Waffen-SS a potential war crime. Though exceptions were carved out for those forced to enlist after 1943, provided they had no direct hand in any of the atrocities. What followed next was neither the absolute justice that the victims demanded, nor the complete impunity that many of the perpetrators had hoped for. It turned out to be far more complicated and deeply disturbing. While some commanders faced the gallows, others slipped away to South America using stolen passports and completely new names. A few even built respectable new lives in West Germany, quietly collecting government pensions and dying peacefully, surrounded by their families. Others fought to the bitter end in the ruins of Berlin only to be captured by the Red Army and sent to Soviet labor camps, never to return. The story of the Waffen-SS after 1945 is absolutely not a clean tale of justice served. Instead, it is the dark reality of a rebuilding world that simply lacked the will and the means to face the horrors of its own past. And that bitter history, filled with contradictions, its heavy silences and its painfully late revelations, still weighs down the memory of Europe 80 years later. The very first to suffer the consequences of defeat were those who surrendered to the Red Army, and their fate was, by far, the most brutal. As the Eastern Front collapsed in the final chaotic weeks of the war, thousands of Waffen-SS soldiers were captured in combat, caught fleeing down muddy roads, or seized while trying to slip through Soviet lines disguised as civilians. Identifying them was relatively easy for Soviet troops. A huge number of Waffen-SS members carried their blood type tattooed right under their left armpit, a standard practice of the organization. That tiny ink mark, meant to save lives through quick transfusions on the battlefield, suddenly became a permanent death warrant inside the grim Soviet detention centers. Slicing it off with a pocket knife, as some desperately tried, only left an equally damning scar. Soviet treatment of Waffen-SS captives was never held to the same standards as regular Wehrmacht prisoners, even though those regular soldiers were also subjected to incredibly brutal conditions themselves. According to official estimates from the International Committee of the Red Cross, between 70,000 and 100,000 German prisoners perished in Soviet labor camps between 1945 and 1950. The terrible conditions mirrored, with a dark and tragic irony, the nightmares the Nazis had once inflicted on their victims. Meager rations, completely insufficient to sustain the heavy labor. Rampant diseases left without proper medical treatment, and 12-hour workdays in punishing, sub-zero weather. Drafts sweeping through uninsulated barracks where men shivered on bare wooden platforms without blankets during freezing Siberian winters. Most of those who managed to survive the brutal early years were not released until the middle of the 1950s. Following the death of Stalin in 1953 and the intense political negotiations between West Germany and the Soviet Union, the ultimate fate of the various foreign national groups who had fought under the SS ruins depended almost entirely on who captured them and the shifting political climate of their home nations. The Russian and Cossack volunteers who had chosen to serve in the ranks of the Waffen-SS, such as the 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps, absorbed into the Waffen-SS in November 1944, were forcibly returned to the Soviet Union under the terms of the Yalta Agreement. Stalin had stubbornly insisted that every single Soviet citizen captured by the Western Allies had to be repatriated without any conditions. In many instances, this repatriation was carried out by brutal force, with terrified prisoners literally fighting not to be dragged onto the trains. Once on Soviet soil, they were branded traitors. Many were immediately executed, while the survivors were dragged off to the Gulag. The situation for the Ukrainians of the 14th Waffen-SS Volunteer Grenadier Division, the 1st Ukrainian, better known as the Galicia Division, was fundamentally different. This unit was formed in 1943, drawing in volunteers from Galicia, a region of western Ukraine that had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until 1918. Many of these men had gone into battle believing they were fighting for the eventual independence of Ukraine, not for the German Reich. Once the war ended, the Galicia Division surrendered to British forces in Austria, but the Soviets immediately demanded their repatriation. Crucially, The International Red Cross, the Vatican, and the Polish government in exile stepped in to advocate on their behalf, pointing out that a vast majority of their soldiers came from regions that, prior to 1939, belonged to Poland and not the Soviet Union. Their argument actually worked, and they were not sent back. After spending some time locked up in Italy, they were allowed to move to the United Kingdom, while a smaller number went to Canada and Australia. Over in the zones controlled by the Americans, the British and the French, things were different, but still incredibly harsh. Life inside the makeshift Allied prison camps in those first few months right after surrender was, in so many cases, absolutely miserable. Millions of men were being processed all at once, and the basic infrastructure could not keep up. Many prisoners were kept in open-air pens, constantly fighting off deadly diseases, hunger, and complete uncertainty about what lay ahead. The Allied authorities, dealing with a massive crowd of detainees ranging from top war criminals to 17-year-old conscripts, focused their energy on picking out the high-ranking officers and those clearly tied to specific, brutal crimes. The denazification process, designed to figure out the individual guilt of every single regime member, was supposed to be incredibly thorough. Back in 1946, the Allies set up a system dividing people into 5 distinct categories. These were major offenders, known as Hauptschuldige, and activists, called Belastite. Lesser offenders, or Minder Belastite, passive followers, or Mitläufer, and finally, those completely exonerated, the Entlastite. These denazification courts ended up prosecuting millions of citizens, but heavy political pressure, severely overloaded courtrooms, the looming shadow of the Cold War on the horizon, and the clear interest of the Western Allies to rebuild Germany as a solid shield against Soviet communism slowly ate away at the strictness of the whole process. By 1948, thousands of active cases were simply dismissed, reduced, or wrapped up with incredibly light sentences. The regular, low-ranking soldiers who managed to prove they were drafted by force or had no connection to any documented crimes were set free, with most of them returning home between 1946 and 1947. Stepping out of those camps, they found a nation completely in ruins, with no jobs, and carrying the heavy stigma of belonging to what was now a certified criminal organization. Many chose total silence just to survive. They returned to shattered cities, found hard work in construction or factories, and made sure they never spoke a single word to their families about what they did between 1939 and 1945. Their kids did not ask, and neither did the neighbors. Yet, some were immediately recruited by Allied powers for their own ends. Western intelligence quickly saw the immense value in the specialized knowledge and deep contacts of former SS officers as the Cold War began to heat up. Reinhard Gehlen, the powerful chief of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front, surrendered directly to the Americans and offered up everything he knew about the Soviet Union in exchange for safety. His network, famously known as the Gehlen Organization, became a vital tool for the CIA in Europe and laid the groundwork for the modern West German intelligence agency, the BND. Both Gehlen and a large portion of his associates came straight out of the Reich security services, even if not all of them were official members of the Waffen-SS, and some had served in the SD, the SS security service. Soon, the fight over military pensions became the most visible battle of the post-war era. The Federal War Victims Assistance Act, passed back in 1950, known as the Bundesversorgungsgesetz, was created specifically to support disabled veterans and grieving war widows. But the debate over whether former members of the Waffen-SS should get the same government benefits as regular Wehrmacht soldiers sparked instant controversy. After all, the Allies had officially declared the SS a criminal organization, not a regular military branch. Excluding them from benefits would have aligned with that verdict. But actually doing so meant angering a massive voting bloc in a fragile, brand-new democracy that desperately needed stability. In 1953, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer went public, claiming that the men of the Waffen-SS had fought as honorable soldiers just like everyone else. That statement was partly driven by heavy pressure from the HIAG Veterans Lobby Group, partly a cold political calculation, and partly a reflection of a post-war society that preferred quiet collective amnesia over painful confrontation. In practice, this meant that many former SS members could go ahead and claim partial pensions. especially those who managed to prove they were drafted after 1943 and had not volunteered to serve, but for the survivors of the Holocaust, who so often received absolutely no comparable compensation for several decades. This decision felt like a moral betrayal that was hard to forgive. Then, in 1956, as West Germany established its brand new armed forces, the Bundeswehr, the troubling question surfaced once again. Could former SS members wear the uniform and serve? In theory, the answer was yes under specific conditions. Be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into history. In practice, out of the 3,117 former members of the Waffen-SS who applied to join the new force, only 508 were actually accepted. The rest were rejected due to their ideological backgrounds, criminal records, or direct pressure from Allied advisors who were still supervising the process of German rearmament. Those who entered the Bundeswehr usually stayed completely quiet about their own past. When speaking with officers from other NATO nations, the entire subject remained a tacit taboo. The massive structural problem that Allied prosecutors faced was the sheer, overwhelming scale of an organization that at its absolute peak had almost 1 million members across 38 divisions, and a sprawling administrative structure that stretched all the way from the Führungsamt in Berlin down to execution squads in tiny Belarusian villages. It was simply humanly impossible to prosecute every single perpetrator. Hard priorities had to be established. Prominent, well-known war criminals, the brutal commanders of the Einsatzgruppen death squads, and the directors of the concentration camps, those responsible for documented massacres, were the main priority. The middle-ranking officers could simply wait. Common soldiers were generally not prosecuted unless there was specific testimony against them. The final result was a system of justice that remained inevitably and deeply incomplete. The notorious SS Totenkopf Division, which was responsible for guarding the concentration camps from their very origins and directly implicated in the brutal death marches, saw only a tiny fraction of its members ever face real legal consequences. The exact same thing happened to members of the Das Reich Division, whose dark history included the horrific, systematic massacres of Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane in June 1944. 99 people were murdered in Toul and 642 in Oradour, including 247 innocent, defenseless children, and whose division commander Heinz Lammerding lived a peaceful life until 1971 in West Germany, building a highly successful business career under the protection of a law that strictly forbade the extradition of German citizens. For the Viking Division, responsible for horrific crimes in Ukraine, the situation was very similar. But in Yugoslavia, the approach was quite different. President Josip Broz Tito, fully aware that he had to unite ethnic groups with deep histories of mutual wartime violence, adopted a highly pragmatic policy. Those who could be directly accused of specific, documented crimes against Yugoslav citizens were prosecuted, but the rest were simply granted a blanket amnesty. This even included former SS members from notorious formations like the 13th Handschar Mountain Division and the 7th Volunteer Mountain Division SS Prinz Eugen. Many of the Bosnian, Serbian, and Croatian volunteers who had actively fought under the SS runes quietly returned to their home communities, where wartime memories and lingering loyalties remained a highly complex matter that official state politics preferred not to dig up again. What was left after that whole process was a Germany that had indeed condemned its very worst war criminals at Nuremberg, but had also quietly reintegrated tens of thousands of willing accomplices back into normal civilian life. A Europe that had judged only the very tip of the iceberg, while leaving the vast, deep base of the pyramid completely untouched, creating an entire generation of perpetrators who quickly learned that absolute silence was the best strategy for survival in the New World. Just before Allied forces could actually reach the concentration camps, the SS desperately organized one of the most unimaginably cruel episodes of the entire war. From the cold of January 1945 right up until the very first chaotic days of May, while over 250,000 prisoners were forced to march on foot for grueling days and weeks from camps in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Eastern Germany deep into the heart of the Reich. The order for this came directly from Heinrich Himmler and the Joint High Command of the SS. Their primary, urgent objective was to stop concentration camp prisoners from ever being successfully liberated by the rapidly advancing Allies. For the desperate regime, letting the actual witnesses of the genocide go free was a threat just as severe as their own military defeat. These chosen routes were long, completely inhuman, and utterly deadly. The prisoners, skeletal from starvation and mostly sick, barely covered in tattered rags and barefoot in the freezing winter cold. They were forced to struggle through dozens of kilometers every single day under the heavily armed watch of the Totenkopf units, the brutal camp guards. Those who fell, those who stopped, those who simply could not go on, were executed right on the road without a single exception. Many times, local villagers watched these agonizing columns pass by without doing anything to intervene. A few tried to hand out bread or water, but most just closed their doors and pulled down their blinds. One of the absolute longest of these marches was the massive evacuation of the Auschwitz concentration camp on January 18, 1945, just 9 days before the Red Army finally arrived. While over 56,000 prisoners were forced to march toward the west, around 15,000 died during that single horrific operation from the freezing cold, starvation, or being executed right on the road. Those who actually managed to survive were taken to other camps like Gross Rosen, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen, places where the daily conditions were just as lethal. On April 13, 1945, near Gardelegen, SS soldiers along with members of the local militia locked roughly 1,000 helpless prisoners inside a large barn and set the entire structure on fire. They were burned alive. When the American soldiers arrived at the site some days later, all they found were ashes and bones. On the Mauthausen March, which started on April 11th, thousands of prisoners who had come from Gunskirchen and various other subcamps trudged for days along dusty Austrian country roads. Many of them died right on the path. When American troops finally liberated the camp on May 5th, they discovered thousands of dead bodies and hundreds of survivors clinging to life in agony. During the Nuremberg Trials, camp commanders and high-ranking SS officers pointed to superior orders, a deep fear of retaliation, or absolute ignorance. The evidence was overwhelming. Those death marches were never just chaotic accidents. They were very conscious decisions. Systematic orders carried out by the SS hierarchy right down to the very last days of the war. On September 29, 1947, the 9th of 12 subsequent trials began in the courtroom at Nuremberg, organized by the American authorities in their German occupation zone. 24 high-ranking officers were put on trial, all from the Einsatzgruppen, those mobile death squads that trailed behind the German army during its brutal invasion of the Soviet Union. Their explicit purpose had been to exterminate Jews, communists, Roma, and anyone else deemed an active enemy of the Reich. Between 1941 and 1943, these mobile groups murdered more than 1 million people. There were no gas chambers, no crematorium ovens, just cold bullets. The most prominent figure among the defendants was Otto Ohlendorf, the commander of Einsatzgruppe D, who was held responsible for more than 90,000 murders in southern Ukraine and Crimea. He was an educated man, a professional economist, and a former official in the Reich Ministry of Economics. Throughout the trial, he remained cold, rational, and completely unbothered. He did not deny the killings, but rather justified them as necessary, preventive measures to protect the security of the Reich. The weekly reports sent by the commanders back to SS headquarters documented everything with a sort of cold, academic precision, listing the exact number of elements eliminated, their term for human victims, meticulously categorized by ethnicity, gender, and age. One of the most brutal documents was the Jaeger report, put together by Commander Karl Jaeger of Einsatzkommando 3, which meticulously recorded the cold-blooded murder of 137,346 individuals between July and December of 1941 in Lithuania. That brutal document listed every single execution down to the smallest detail. The final verdicts were handed down on April 10, 1948. Out of the 24 defendants, 14 were sentenced to death, and 2 were given life in prison. The remaining men received prison sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. Among those sentenced to hang was Paul Blobel, the man directly responsible for the horrific Babi Yar massacre, where more than 3,000 innocent people were slaughtered. In just 2 days in September of 1941, Otto Ohlendorf was condemned too. The executions were finally carried out on June 7, 1951, inside Landsberg prison. Blobel begged for forgiveness before he died. Ohlendorf, however, insisted right up to the end that history would vindicate him. He died fully convinced he had done the right thing. The trial went on to set fundamental precedents in international criminal law. War crimes could now be prosecuted, regardless of the official rank or status of the accused. Simply obeying orders was no longer a valid legal defense when it came to genocide. Individual criminal responsibility existed, even when operating deep inside strict military hierarchies. Heinrich Himmler, the SS Reichsfuhrer and the main architect of the most lethal killing machine of the 20th century, tried in his final weeks to cast himself as Germany's savior. On April 21, 1945, he sent emissaries through Sweden to pitch a separate peace deal with the British and the Americans, while keeping the ongoing war against the Soviet Union fully active. Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross received the proposal and quickly passed it along to London and Washington. The response was an immediate, flat refusal. When Hitler learned of this betrayal, he stripped Himmler of all his official offices by decree. The man who had been the second most powerful figure in the Reich for years was suddenly declared an enemy of the state. Himmler fled, swapped his uniform, disguised himself, let his mustache grow out, and covered one eye with a black patch. He assumed the false identity of Heinrich Hitzinger, carrying the papers of a Wehrmacht sergeant. On May 21, 1945, soldiers from the British Second Army were conducting routine identity checks near Bremervord when they pulled aside 3 suspicious-looking men. Their nervous behavior quickly drew attention, especially because one of those men was wearing a patch over his eye. When they were brought to an interrogation camp in Lüneburg, the medical officers ordered the main suspect to strip down and remove his eye patch. The eye underneath was perfectly healthy. It was Himmler. Left with no other choice, he finally admitted who he was. On May 23, 1945, during a medical exam, while they were checking inside his mouth, Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden between his teeth. The British doctors tried desperately to revive him, but it was useless. He died in 15 minutes. They buried him in an unmarked grave near Lüneburg. The exact location was kept strictly secret by the British Army to prevent it from ever becoming a place of worship. The fates of the camp commanders varied wildly. Rudolf Haas, the notorious commander of Auschwitz, initially managed to escape by posing as a simple farm laborer. On March 11, 1946, British soldiers finally captured him near Flensburg. Later, during his trial in Poland, he testified that at least 2,500,000 victims were executed and systematically murdered in Auschwitz by gassing and burning, while another 500,000 perished from starvation and disease. On April 16, 1947, he was executed by hanging right there inside the Auschwitz concentration camp itself. Friedrich Jeckeln, the man responsible for the brutal Babi Yar massacre and the mass shooting of 25,000 Jews at Rumbula, was eventually captured by Soviet forces. In January of 1946, he faced a Soviet military tribunal in Riga, Latvia, where he fully admitted his guilt. On February 3, 1946, standing before a large crowd of 4,000 onlookers, right there in Victory Square in Riga, he was executed by hanging. Odilo Globoknik, who supervised Operation Reinhard, which led to the brutal murder of between 1.5 million and 2 million Jews, and oversaw the construction of the death camps of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, was hunted down in the Alps by a British patrol in May 1945. A British officer suddenly called out his last name to trap him. Globoknik instinctively turned his head right toward him. Realizing his fatal mistake, he tried to act as if nothing had happened, but it was far too late. As they were leading him to his cell, he bit down on a cyanide capsule. He died right there on the prison floor. Oskar Dirlewanger, commander of the infamous brigade bearing his name, who was responsible for unspeakable atrocities in Poland and Belarus that defied all human comprehension, was finally recognized by a former concentration camp prisoner on June 1, 1945. Luftwaffe Lieutenant Anton Fussinger, who ended up sharing a prison cell with him, later described what he witnessed: raw, bleeding wounds all over Dirlewanger's face, and his entire body covered in heavy welts. Every single night, Polish guards dragged him out of his cell. On June 7, 1945, just 6 days after his capture, the official cause of death was listed as a heart attack. In reality, he had been beaten to death. Richard Glucks, who oversaw the massive network of concentration camps as successor to General Theodor Eicke and inspector of the camps, was the very official who proposed Auschwitz as a highly suitable site for a new camp back in February 1940. On May 10, 1945, inside the Merwick Naval Base in Flensburg, he swallowed a deadly capsule of cyanide. Otto Ohlendorf and Paul Blobel were executed on June 7, 1951, in Landsberg. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer to stand trial at Nuremberg, and who had taken over complete control of the Gestapo and the concentration camp system in 1942 after Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated, was ultimately sentenced to death. His final words on October 16, 1946, were simple and defiant. "I have loved my German people and my fatherland with a warm and genuine heart. I have done my duty by the laws of my people, and I feel that this time my nation was led by men who were not soldiers, and that crimes were committed of which I had absolutely no knowledge." The ultimate fate of Hans Kammler, the brutal SS general who oversaw the construction of the concentration camps and directed the secret V-2 missile program, remains one of the most heavily debated mysteries of the entire post-war era. His very last confirmed public appearance was on April 17, 1945. Later, his family requested that he be legally declared dead as of May 9 of that same year. The District Court of Berlin, Charlottenburg, finally approved this request in September of 1948. Some historians have suggested that Kammler might have negotiated protection with the Americans in exchange for his deep knowledge of rocket technology, though no solid documentary evidence has ever surfaced. Heinrich Müller, the notorious head of the Gestapo nicknamed Gestapo Müller, vanished entirely without a trace. His last confirmed sighting was on May 1, 1945, inside Hitler's underground bunker. He was never taken alive. In 2013, a German historian claimed to have uncovered solid evidence, proving that Müller actually died in Berlin in 1945 and was buried in a mass grave. Though other experts quickly disputed this, the dark mystery still remains unsolved today. The historic term ratlines refers to the underground networks of secret escape routes that, between 1945 and the early 1950s, helped smuggle thousands of Nazi war criminals out of Europe, including hundreds of former Waffen-SS members and high-ranking officers from the Reich security apparatus, fleeing towards South America, the Middle East, and to a lesser extent, Australia. It was never a single, centralized system, but rather a constellation of parallel organizations that shared similar methods, same infrastructure, and often the very same middlemen. The most crucial geographic starting point was Rome. In 1945 and 1946, this city was the ultimate crossroads of Europe. It sheltered tens of thousands of displaced war refugees who had no papers at all. Relief organizations handed out identity documents without checking very much, while a network of monasteries and convents offered shelter, asking absolutely no questions. On top of that, the Vatican presence provided a layer of diplomatic and logistical immunity that no other European city could hope to match. Operating from the Pontifical Teutonic College of Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, the Austrian Bishop Alois Hudel ran a quiet operation, an operation he would later describe in his 1976 memoirs as a simple, purely humanitarian mission to save desperate soldiers from the hateful clutches of the victorious Allies. Back in 1937, Hudel had published an incredibly controversial book that caused quite a stir, in which he tried to reconcile Catholicism with National Socialism. This effort earned him a sharp reprimand from the Vatican, pushing him far away from any real ecclesiastical circles of power. During the post-war years, he saw his chance for personal rehabilitation by leading an escape route he framed as purely charitable work. He provided letters of recommendation and logistical support to notorious figures like Franz Stangl, the commander of the Sobibor and Treblinka death camps, where approximately 1,700,000 people were murdered. Stangl used identity papers from the International Committee of the Red Cross, papers secured with the direct help of Hudel, allowing him to travel to Syria in 1948 and from there to Brazil in 1951. He was finally captured in Sao Paulo in 1967, extradited to West Germany, and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1970. He died of heart failure in his prison cell in 1971. The exact role of the International Red Cross deserves a very precise analysis, as it has often been subject to serious misunderstandings. Back then, the organization issued travel documents called Reiseausweis, which served as identity papers for displaced persons, handed out to almost anyone claiming to be stateless or displaced. The standard procedure did not involve any background checks. The agency had absolutely no mechanisms to detect fake identities, nor did they have access to the criminal files of the Allied powers. When it was discovered in later years that the organization had issued these documents to Nazi war criminals, and that at least 8,000 people used them to successfully emigrate to South America, the leadership acknowledged the situation but rightly pointed out that their system had been exploited by networks operating completely outside their knowledge. While that explanation is factually correct, it does not cover every single case. Some local Red Cross officials certainly had documented connections with key intermediaries in these escape networks. The second major escape pipeline was the network linked directly to SS Gruppenführer Karl Wolff and other SS officers who had served in Italy. Wolff had actually been the supreme commander of the SS in Italy, serving as the key middleman in secret negotiations with the American OSS that led to an early surrender in northern Italy back in May of 1945. A secret operation known as Sonnenaufgang, or Sunrise. That early cooperation earned him highly preferential treatment from the Allies. He was never prosecuted at Nuremberg, though he was later tried and sentenced in Germany in 1964 to 15 years in prison, a term reduced for good behavior and health, for his role in deporting 300,000 Italian Jews. His deep network in northern Italy included wealthy industrialists, prominent aristocrats, and church officials who gladly facilitated the escape of numerous SS officers towards Spain and South America. Spain under the Franco regime served as the second major transit corridor. The official neutrality of Spain during the war, combined with the ideological affinity of the Franco regime for National Socialism, created a perfect, welcoming environment for hiding Nazi fugitives quietly. Post-war Madrid was a city literally teeming with German citizens, from economic exiles and technicians hired by Spanish companies, to undercover spies posing as businessmen and wanted war criminals waiting for travel documents to continue their journey. The Spanish police simply refused to cooperate with Allied investigations into these war criminals. Officers of the Political Social Brigade had strict, direct orders to completely stay out of the affairs of the German colony. Otto Skorzeny, the notorious Waffen-SS officer famous for his daring rescue of Mussolini at Gran Sasso in September of 1943, and also for commanding the highly specialized infiltration units during the Battle of the Ardennes in December of 1944, eventually settled in Madrid in the early 1950s after escaping Allied custody in 1948. From Spain, he organized a deep network of former German military officers, private security firms, and foreign intelligence services, including the Israeli Mossad, which, according to some reports, used his extensive contacts throughout the Arab world. Skorzeny worked to train the Egyptian National Security Forces under the regime of Nasser. He was never once tried for the horrific crimes committed under his command, eventually dying in Madrid in 1975, the exact same year as Franco. Argentina became the ultimate main destination for fleeing Nazi war criminals. The government of Juan Domingo Perón carefully maintained a stance of neutrality throughout the war, but that neutral mask barely hid a deep sympathy for the Axis powers. Post-war, the regime actively welcomed skilled European specialists, bringing in a wave of German scientists, skilled technicians, medical doctors, and military officers, many of whom had dark pasts that made them completely unwelcome in any other Western nation. In 1946, Perón signed migration agreements with European organizations, paving the way for a massive wave of immigration from Europe. Argentine government archives, which were partially declassified back in the 1990s, proved that the Peronist administration knew these immigrants included brutal war criminals, and in several cases, they actively helped them cross the border. Adolf Eichmann, the man who managed the logistics of the Holocaust within the terrifying machinery of the SS, slipped into Argentina in 1950 under the alias Ricardo Clement, using a passport issued by the International Red Cross in Genoa. He quietly settled down in the Buenos Aires suburb of San Fernando, working for several industrial companies. To his neighbors, he was just a quiet German family man. But his hiding spot was eventually leaked to the Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence agency, by Lothar Hermann, who had survived the horrors of the Dachau concentration camp. Hermann was living in Buenos Aires, and his daughter had actually been dating Eichmann's own son. This crucial tip led the Mossad to launch Operation Garibaldi, directed by Agent Rafi Eitan. 11 Israeli agents secretly traveled to Buenos Aires, where they tracked Eichmann's daily routine for weeks, finally snatching him on May 11, 1960, right at his usual bus stop on Garibaldi Street. They kept him heavily drugged in a safe house for 9 days while they carefully prepared his secret extraction. On May 20, 1960, he was smuggled out of Argentina on an El Al flight, disguised as a sick crew member using a set of fake papers. He was put on trial in Jerusalem, appearing before the local district court starting on April 11, 1961. The trial, presided over by Judge Moshe Landau, lasted for grueling months. It drew 100 accredited journalists from around the globe and was the very first televised trial in Israel's history. Renowned philosopher Hannah Arendt covered the proceedings for The New Yorker, and her observations there led her to coin the famous concept, the banality of evil. Eichmann was ultimately found guilty of atrocious crimes against humanity and horrific war crimes on the 11th of December, 1961. He was sentenced to death on December 15th and executed by hanging on June 1, 1962, inside the walls of Ramla prison. To this day, it remains the only judicial execution ever carried out in Israel's history. Joseph Mengele, the notorious SS physician at Auschwitz-Birkenau, was responsible for the selections at the arrival ramp and conducted gruesome experiments on living prisoners, which included injecting chemicals into children's eyes to try and change their color, performing amputations without any anesthesia, and conducting monstrous experiments on twins. He fled Auschwitz on January 17, 1945, which was just 3 days before the camp was fully evacuated, taking his sick research files with him. He spent the next few months hiding in various parts of Germany. He was briefly captured by the Allied forces, but was released because they failed to identify him. And he eventually made it to Argentina in 1949 under the name Helmut Greger, using International Red Cross documents. Shockingly, he obtained Argentine citizenship in 1956 under his own real name. Once Eichmann's capture made it chillingly clear that the Mossad was actively operating inside Argentina. Mengele quickly fled first to Paraguay, where he also secured citizenship, and then escaped over to Brazil, settling down under the protection of a German family in the town of Embu das Artes, quite close to São Paulo. He eventually drowned on February 7, 1979, at Bertioga Beach in Brazil, after suffering a sudden stroke while he was out for a swim. His remains were finally identified through DNA analysis in 1992 by comparing them directly with genetic samples from his son, Rolf. He was never captured or put on trial. Remarkably, West Germany did not even issue an arrest warrant for him until 1959, a full 14 years after the war ended. Klaus Barbie was the brutal chief of the Gestapo in the city of Lyon between November 1942 and August 1944. He was infamously dubbed the Butcher of Lyon because of his personal role in the torture and mass deportation of thousands of innocent people, which included the targeted arrest and deportation of 44 Jewish children from the colony of Izu on April 6, 1944. Every single one of them was murdered in Auschwitz. Barbie was also personally responsible for capturing and torturing the French resistance leader Jean Moulin, who died under brutal interrogation in July of 1943. When the war finally ended, Barbie was recruited by the Counterintelligence Corps of the United States Army, the CIC, which used him between 1947 and 1951 as an informant to gather intelligence on communist networks operating across Europe. In 1950, when they learned the French wanted him for war crimes, the CIC actively helped him escape. They connected him with Krunoslav Draganovic, a Croatian priest. Dragonovic ran Rome's Pontifical College of San Geronimo, and he quickly secured Barbie's travel papers and Bolivian visa. Arriving in 1951 under the alias Klaus Altmann, Barbie spent years quietly trading timber and machinery. In 1971, journalist Ladislas de Hoyos and French investigator Beat Klarsfeld tracked him down in La Paz. Bolivia expelled him in 1983. Extradited to France, he was tried for crimes against humanity, sentenced to life in 1987, and died in Lyon in 1991. The existence of a single organization named Odessa, standing for the Organization of Former SS Members, is a complex topic demanding strict historical accuracy. The concept was popularized by Frederick Forsyth's best-selling fiction novel, The Odessa File, published in 1972, alongside reports by Simon Wiesenthal, though modern historical research has since proven that their actual existence was far more complex. No evidence shows a centralized group under that name operating as a single unified network with clear leadership. What actually existed were multiple parallel escape routes and networks, sometimes loosely coordinated, sharing critical resources, safe houses, contacts, and escape methods. Some historians, like Yukai Goni, in his 2002 book, The Real Odessa, identified specific networks proving the Argentine state actively collaborated. They did not just look away, they welcomed these were criminals. The difference is massive. It is one thing to ignore a fugitive, and another to send diplomats to Europe to recruit them. Simon Wiesenthal survived Mauthausen. He went on to establish the Jewish Documentation Center in Vienna in 1947. For decades, he gathered survivor accounts, traced documents, and fed vital information to prosecutors in many nations. His methods were not those of an archival academic, but rather those of an active collector of testimonies and clues. This brought him deep admiration, but also academic criticism. He even admitted to making errors in some cases. Yet his work to keep relentless pressure on Western governments so they would actively hunt down these were criminals was absolutely irreplaceable during long years when the political will to do so was almost entirely gone. Wiesenthal claimed that his efforts directly contributed to locating and arresting more than 1,100 Nazi war criminals, a massive number that drew both praise and intense scrutiny. Though critics disputed that number, his impact is unquestionable. He died in Vienna in 2005, aged 96. In May 1951, in the town of Verden an der Aller, former Waffen-SS members held their historic founding meeting. They formed the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Einheorigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, known simply as HIAG, founded by top commanders Hauser, Kumm, and Steiner. From day one, this group claimed to be a mutual aid society, but its real mission was deeply political. They focused on securing complete legal and social rehabilitation for all veterans who had served in the notorious Waffen-SS, fighting to match their legal status with the regular army and secure government pensions. Paul Hauser was 71. He became the public face of this rehabilitation, having commanded the 2nd SS Panzer Corps on both fronts. Even regular army officers respected him, and some allies acknowledged his military professionalism. For many years, Hauser was the key figure that HIAG presented to the public as absolute proof that the Waffen-SS were just professional soldiers, not ideological tools of the regime. In 1953, he published a widely read book, Soldaten wie andere auch, which translates to Soldiers Like Any Other, which argued that Waffen-SS combat forces had nothing to do with Nazi atrocities. Though this clean myth was historically false, it was eagerly embraced by the emerging political culture of 1950s West Germany, needing to integrate millions of veterans into a new democracy without causing social chaos. In 1951, HIAG launched a monthly magazine called Der Freiwillige, which ran for over 40 years. Inside its pages, brutal Eastern Front battles were retold in highly sanitized, clinical, and strictly military terms that ignored all atrocities. And they printed obituaries for their fallen comrades. Reunions of former divisions were announced. They fought appeals in the pension courts while systematically building an alternative history, a direct challenge to the narrative that academic historians were carefully putting together. Before shutting down in 1992, their magazine published over 500 issues. Articles signed by former SS officers reframed those bloody Eastern Front battles as Europe fighting a desperate struggle against Bolshevism, erasing all the brutal massacres, along with the forced deportations and systematic exploitation of occupied populations, the dark, ugly reality behind those very same military campaigns. Their closely linked publishing house, Munin Verlag, based out of Osnabrück, flooded the market with more than 57 separate volumes of military history detailing the Waffen-SS divisions between 1954 and the late 1980s. These books, mostly written by former officers of the very units they described, sat on German bookstore shelves right next to legitimate, mainstream history works. Quite a few were translated into English, French, and Spanish. Several sold tens of thousands of copies, mimicking traditional military history with their detailed maps, precise orders of battle, and chronological timelines of operations. Yet they systematically left out any mention of the horrific crimes committed by these very same combat units. The executions of captured prisoners, the slaughter of civilians, and active roles in deportations. This produced books you could read from cover to cover without ever learning that the Das Reich Division had burned 642 civilians alive in Oradauer-Circling. The political strategy of the HIAG was just as calculated. Their representatives personally attended Bundestag parliamentary committees to testify about service conditions in the Waffen-SS, aggressively pushing to match their pensions with those of regular Wehrmacht veterans. They paid for lawyers to defend veterans facing denazification tribunals, while funding the campaigns of conservative politicians who openly advocated for the rehabilitation of these veterans. Back in 1953, when Chancellor Adenauer made his famous statement, declaring that the men of the Waffen-SS had fought as honorable soldiers just like anyone else, the HIAG celebrated it as a massive political triumph. Even though Adenauer was careful never to repeat those words where they could be directly challenged, the damage was done. Still, the pension issue remained the most tangible battleground, directly shaping the daily survival of thousands of aging veterans. Under the 1950 pension law known as the Bundesversorgungsgesetz, former Waffen-SS members did not hold any automatic right to the military pensions guaranteed to regular Wehrmacht veterans. This drove the HIAG to launch a massive, case-by-case legal campaign to claw back recognition. Legal precedents slowly began to shift throughout the 1950s. German courts slowly started granting these pensions to former Waffen-SS members who could successfully prove they were forcibly drafted after September 1943. The point where the organization started forcing conscripts into service rather than relying purely on willing volunteers, and had no proven record of participating in activities the Allied tribunals declared criminal. This created an unspoken, two-tiered system. The volunteer from 1939 or 1940 was treated as highly suspicious. The draftee from 1944, on the other hand, was seen as a mere victim of circumstances. While that arbitrary distinction made some degree of legal sense, it completely ignored the fact that in 1944, the Waffen-SS were still executing the exact same brutal reprisal operations and serving the same terror apparatus as they had in 1940. Inside the newly formed Bundeswehr, established in 1956, the highly sensitive question of integrating former Waffen-SS officers was handled with extreme caution. Former Wehrmacht General Adolf Husinger, who once served as the chief of operations for the OKH General Staff, became the very first Inspector General of this new army. Western allies had firmly insisted that this new German military force must possess a completely different character from the old, discredited army. A specialized advisory board known as the Personalgüterausschuss, or Personnel Screening Committee, vetted every single file of officers applying to join. Out of 3,117 former Waffen-SS members who applied, only 508 made the cut. Grounds for rejection included clear, documented involvement in wartime atrocities, SS files proving service in units specifically tied to massacres of civilians, or direct objections raised by Allied screening officers. The HIAG also maintained highly ambiguous ties with the German far-right. Several of its key members actively participated in the Sozialistische Reichspartei, an organization banned as unconstitutional by the German Constitutional Court in 1952, or in the Deutsche Reichspartei. For the most part, these connections stayed completely hidden during the 50s and 60s, as the group desperately tried to project a highly respectable public image. But in 1978, Der Spiegel magazine blew it all wide open with a massive exposé, detailing deep connections between the HIAG and far-right political parties, showing how convicted war criminals were regularly showing up and sitting in on their official organization meetings, and proving the apologetic nature of all their historical books. This report had a massive, very real political impact. Several politicians who had quietly kept up ties with the HIAG quickly cut them off in public. The group responded by calling the article pure slander, yet they simply could not disprove a single documented fact. Then came the 80s, a rough and painful decade for the HIAG, as their original founding generation began to grow old and weak. Paul Hauser had passed away in 1972, and Felix Steiner was already gone, having died back in 1966. The living memory of the war was fading away, but at the very same time, real academic historians were closing in with much sharper tools. In 1982, historian Bernd Wegner released his landmark study, Hitler's Politische Soldaten, exposing the reality of the Waffen-SS from 1933 all the way to 1945. Using brutal archival proof, this single book systematically tore apart the myth of the Waffen-SS as some kind of clean, apolitical army. Then came the work of Christopher Browning on the police battalions and Martin Brosset on the daily administration of the concentration camp system, directly tying the military actions of the Waffen-SS to the machinery of genocide. Soon, the defensive writings of the HIAG started looking hopelessly outdated, even to some of the veterans inside their own ranks. The national group officially dissolved in 1992, though local chapters of aging veterans kept meeting on their own, very quietly, for several years. A few went on to print their own private memoirs and newsletters without any official backing, desperately clinging to that same defensive bias. The final massive, documented gathering of these former Waffen-SS members in Germany took place in the small town of Fallingbostel in 2005, bringing together about 200 extremely elderly veterans. The SS, which once fielded nearly 1 million men, was reduced to a handful of old men, still stubbornly refusing to face what they had actually done. And yet, the intellectual footprint of the HIAG outlived the group itself. Books printed by their publisher, Munin Verlag, still float around in used bookshops and across the darkest corners of the internet. For some obscure, minor battles on secondary fronts, these texts remain the only detailed source of information left, and their purely military content is still sometimes cited by academic historians, though always with extreme caution. But on online message boards, in militaria collector groups, and within certain far-right circles, these books are shared freely, with absolutely no critical filter. The clean narrative that the HIAG spent 40 years building found a powerful new life online, spreading in ways those old soldiers could never have imagined. Then, on November 11, 1989, as the Berlin Wall crumbled, the deeply classified archives of East Germany and Eastern Europe were suddenly thrown wide open. Locked inside those vaults was everything the communist regimes had spent over 4 decades quietly collecting. There were original SS documents captured at the end of the war, detailed records of the German occupation, and first-hand survivor testimonies gathered by intense investigators all across the Soviet bloc. Getting access to these raw materials completely revolutionized how historians looked at the history of the Waffen-SS. Perhaps the most striking example of this was the main, central SS archive located in Berlin-Lichterfeld, which had been torn in half between East and West at the end of the war. The Western papers went to the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, while the Eastern half ended up locked away in the archives of the Stasi, the State Security Ministry, in Berlin-Lichterfeld. Reunification finally allowed historians to examine the complete, combined collection of all those records. The personal service files of SS officers who were still alive and drawing state pensions could now be matched directly against real wartime records that showed exactly what they had done in the field. Years earlier, in 1958, Fritz Bauer, the bold Attorney General of Hesse, had started the very first investigations. to put the people behind the horrors of Auschwitz on trial. Bauer himself had fled Germany after being locked up by the Nazis in 1933, surviving those hard years of exile in both Denmark and Sweden. But he returned home after the war, deeply convinced that the German justice system had an absolute duty to prosecute its very own war criminals. He met fierce, relentless resistance from a post-war legal system where an alarming number of judges and prosecutors had served under the Nazi regime. In fact, during the 1950s, it was estimated that about 80% of top officials in the Ministry of Justice of Rhenania del Norte-Westphalia had been active Nazi Party members. Despite the constant pushback, Bauer successfully forced the famous Frankfurt Auschwitz trials to happen, running from 1963 to 1965. 22 former SS members who had served inside the camp were put on trial. Of those 22 men, only 6 received life sentences. Others received sentences ranging from 3 to 14 years. This trial was actually the very first to bring direct testimony from Holocaust survivors right to the German public. More than 360 witnesses testified, and the cultural impact was absolutely massive, especially on the younger generation who had never known the war. Then, the opening of East European archives in the 90s revealed the sheer scale of crimes that had gone completely uninvestigated. The German Justice Coordination Center over in Ludwigsburg, which was founded back in 1958 to coordinate the investigation of Nazi crimes, had worked for decades with only partial access to the historical records. Now they could finally link specific names in SS files directly with operational logs from Belarus, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Poland that documented brutal massacres. But there was a major catch. Many of those responsible had already died of old age. The few still living were in their 70s, 80s, or even older. Down in Italy, the whole process took even longer. The horrific Sant'Anna di Stazzema massacre took place on August 12, 1944, when the 2nd Battalion of the 35th Regiment of the Reichsfuhrer SS Division, operating under Major Walter Retter, slaughtered 560 civilians in that small Tuscan village of Sant'Anna di Stazzema, including women, the elderly, and young children. Their bodies were then burned. During 1994 and 1995, Italian historians along with military prosecutor Marco de Paulus uncovered key SS documents that linked 10 surviving officers directly to the planning and execution of the operation. The German government was immediately notified. However, just like the earlier case of Heinz Lammerding and Oradauer, the Federal Republic of Germany flatly refused to extradite its own citizens, citing Article 16 of their Basic Law, which up until the year 2000 strictly banned the extradition of German citizens to any foreign nation. An Italian military court in La Spezia finally tried the 10 accused men in absentia, sentencing them to life in prison in 2005. Germany refused to enforce those sentences. The convicted men ended up dying peacefully in their own homes in German cities. The European Parliament even passed formal resolutions condemning this frustrating situation. It changed absolutely nothing on the ground. Then, through the 90s and 2000s, the war pension issue flared up into a recurring political scandal. Investigative journalists and scholars revealed that several former Waffen-SS members, convicted of war crimes abroad, were still receiving monthly state pensions from the German government. Take Arvid Fredriksson, a Danish veteran of the SS Nordland Division, who had been tried and convicted back in Denmark for war crimes. He kept drawing a German war disability pension from their social security system while locked up in a Danish prison. Similar cases came to light during the 2000s, involving Latvian and Estonian Waffen-SS veterans who lived in Germany after migrating there when the Cold War ended. The German Bundestag repeatedly debated proposed amendments to the Federal Pension Act, trying to strip benefits from convicted war criminals. Some changes passed, while others failed. Meanwhile, the complex situation in the Baltic states and Ukraine added a completely different dimension to the debate. Across Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the memory of local Waffen-SS units became deeply intertwined with the memory of fighting Soviet occupation. From the perspective of those who suffered under Soviet rule, the logic was easy to understand. If the Soviet Union was seen as the main threat, and these local Waffen-SS divisions had actively fought against Soviet forces, then those divisions could easily be framed as resistance fighters, even though they wore German uniforms and swore loyalty directly to Adolf Hitler. The 20th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division, also known as the 1st Estonian, and the 19th Grenadier Division, the 2nd Latvian, gradually became subjects of official, state-sanctioned commemorations in Estonia and Latvia respectively. Since the early 2000s, annual marches have been held in Riga every single March 16th, marking the day in 1944 when both Latvian Waffen-SS divisions fought side by side for the very first time. These gatherings bring together aging veterans, their descendants, and occasionally members of far-right political groups from across Europe. The European Parliament has strongly criticized these events in numerous resolutions. The Latvian government counter-argues that the harsh reality of Soviet occupation justifies honoring anyone who fought it, no matter what uniform they wore. Over in Estonia, the Sinimäe Memorial, situated in the Ida-Virumaa region, honors the combatants of the Tannenberg Line, where during the summer of 1944, various Waffen-SS units, including the 20th Estonian Division, fought fiercely for weeks to halt the rapid Soviet advance. It was a highly significant battle, and the casualties on both sides were absolutely staggering. Today, the site openly blends the memory of Estonian soldiers who served under German command with other local resistance fighters, drawing no real distinction. It highlights the deep historical messiness that many of these. The fact that these men also took part in anti-partisan operations, which involved brutal massacres of civilians in the occupied territories in the East, is usually completely ignored during memorial events. Ukraine presented the most politically controversial case. The 14th Waffen-SS Volunteer Grenadier Division, which was the first Ukrainian unit known as the Galicia Division, was symbolically rebuilt in Ukrainian history as an active anti-Soviet resistance group. Back in 2020, the 6th Administrative Court of Appeal ruled that the emblems of the Galicia Division, which featured a golden lion on a blue background, were not Nazi symbols and could be shown. The Ukrainian government did not challenge this. Yet historians point out that the Galicia Division actively took part in anti-partisan operations across Poland and Yugoslavia, which left many civilians dead, and that some of their members had previously served in auxiliary police units, directly helping the Einsatzgruppen carry out massive massacres of innocent Jewish people back in 1941 and 1942. The fierce clash between this dark historical record and Ukraine's collective memory, which has been made worse by the war with Russia that started in 2014, remains completely unresolved. Over in Germany, Section 86A of the Criminal Code strictly bans the public display of outlawed organizations' symbols, including the infamous Sig rune that was used by the SS. This strict law has been enforced in hundreds of different cases since it first started. In reality, collecting SS memorabilia, like old decorated uniforms and historical papers, operates in a legal gray area where private ownership is generally tolerated. But showing them off publicly can be highly illegal, depending on the context and intent. On the internet, the line between historical interest, casual collecting, and active propaganda is completely blurred. The exact same message boards where amateur historians debate the tactics of a Waffen-SS division also feature users with blatant Nazi symbols as their profile pictures. Hard academic research throughout the 1990s and 2000s completely destroyed the myth that the Waffen-SS was just an ordinary, apolitical army. Peter Longerich thoroughly documented this in his 2008 biography of Himmler, showing the direct and active role the Waffen-SS played in the machinery of genocide at every single level. Sönke Neitzel and Harold Welzer published a groundbreaking book in 2011 called Soldaten, which analyzed secret audio recordings of secret conversations between German prisoners of war that were recorded by allies during the conflict. These regular soldiers, including active members of the Waffen-SS, talked about the systematic massacring of helpless civilians and shooting captured prisoners with a chilling casualness, showing just how deeply this horrific violence had been built into their basic understanding of combat. Meanwhile, Christoph Dieckmann proved in his study of Lithuania that the Waffen-SS made up between 25 and 30% of the killing squads known as the Einsatzgruppen during the very first months of the Eastern Front campaign. The work of Alexander Preußen on local SS helpers in occupied Ukraine exposed the massive and terrifying web of collaboration that directly surrounded the Waffen-SS in all those conquered lands. All this massive research accumulated over several decades came far too late for most perpetrators. But it did force a real shift in German history education, altering how museums treat this entire period and reshaping the academic understanding of what this group truly was. Museums that once praised Waffen-SS divisions for their military courage back in the 1950s now feature, in the best cases, entire sections dedicated to their horrific crimes. The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, which first opened back in 2005, does not mention a single unit of the Waffen-SS by its actual name. But its grand scale is the ultimate answer to 40 long years of propaganda books published by Munich Verlag. Today, almost no Waffen-SS veterans are still alive. Their groups have vanished, but their legacy still lingers in deeply unsettling ways. In ongoing debates surrounding historical memory and transitional justice, the story of the Waffen-SS after 1945 offers a very painful and enduring lesson about the strict limits of official justice when trying to handle a crime that involved mass complicity on a societal scale. The Nuremberg Tribunal convicted the top leaders, while later trials caught a few mid-level commanders. But for an organization that actually grew to nearly 1 million men at its peak, the actual share of those who faced real legal consequences was incredibly small. Escape options were everywhere, such as underground networks smuggling notorious war criminals to South America and other distant lands. The intense political pressure from veteran lobbies that directly influenced Germany's major political parties, and the tense logic of the Cold War, which drove both Western powers and the Soviets to use former Nazis for their own secret intelligence networks. Finally, there was the heavy weight of economic pragmatism, which made social reintegration a much higher priority than justice, and perhaps most powerful of all, a vast, collective wall of silence. The heavy silence of the perpetrators about what they had actually done. Then, the silence of families who never asked, and a society looking only ahead. That silence finally began to shatter in the 1960s, first with the trial of Adolf Eichmann, and then in the 1970s with investigative journalistic reports exposing the HIAG, then in the 1980s with those fierce public debates over the actual role of the ordinary German soldier, and far more deeply after 1989. When the secret archives opened and a fresh generation of Germans started asking the very questions their parents and grandparents had actively avoided. The myth of the Waffen-SS soldier as an incredibly passionate combatant, yet apolitical, a modern knight completely untouched by the regime's brutal crimes, was deliberately engineered after the war ended by men who knew exactly what their horrific role had been. That myth survived for decades because it was useful for those trying to slip back into post-war civilian life, for politicians looking to secure votes, and for a general public that preferred the easy comfort of forgetting over the pain of remembering. Modern historians have systematically dismantled that comforting lie. The Waffen-SS were never separate from the regime's horrific atrocities. They were an integral part of the Nazi genocidal machine, both at the front and in the rear. In fact, a full third of the mobile killing squad members came directly from the Waffen-SS. This was even before the invasion of the Soviet Union. Even the actual construction of the gas chambers in Auschwitz was overseen directly by the SS building office. Roughly 7,000 of their members served as active guards inside that camp. 80 years later, the dark history of what happened to the Waffen-SS after 1945 remains a chilling warning about exactly what happens when a society allows the perpetrators of mass crimes to write their own history. It shows the intense effort required to build an honest collective memory. Once that history has already been falsely written,